Really excited to be hosting tonight's talk with Massimiliano Gioni, director of the 55th Venice Biennale. I'd really like to thank Nick and Candida Gertler and everyone at Outset for extending the invitation for making tonight possible. So thank you very, very much to you guys. This is actually the second talk that we've done with Outset, following from the last May's presentation with Louis Perez Aramas, the curatorial director for the 30th São Paulo International Biennial. Just quickly, I point out that we're currently between exhibitions. Jürgen Teller show just ended yesterday, and our next exhibition, 2000 Wasted Years, the first UK retrospective by the Bernadette Corporation, opens next Tuesday on 26th of March. We will certainly hope to see you all at the private view for that, but without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Nick. Thank you very much all. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregor, and yeah, thank you to Gregor and to Antonia and to Matt Williams at the ICA for having us here this evening, and thank you again everyone for coming. And especially thank you to the ICA for opening your doors on a Monday evening. I know it's not normal. A huge thank you also to Massimiliano for taking time out in what sounds like a quite relentless schedule around Europe, talking about the Biennale. So thank you for coming here and talking to us once again. And thank you also to Ute Meta Bauer, who so kindly and enthusiastically agreed to be part of a conversation with Massimiliano after the presentation. So Outset, as part of the International Production Fund, is really delighted to be holding this event this evening. And I wanted to briefly put this evening's presentation and discussion into context. So last year, Outset initiated the International Production Fund, or the IPF. And the IPF is a group of private organizations and individuals who support the production and presentation of new works of art at the world's major exhibitions for subsequent donation to public collections. So the IPF's inaugural project, as Gregor talked about, was the Sao Paulo Biennale, and we're delighted to be supporting the Venice Biennale this year. The organizations supporting the Venice Biennale are Outset England, the Daskalopoulos Dermagon Foundation for Culture and Development in Greece, Outset Netherlands, Outset USA, and the Maurice Marciano Family Foundation, also in the USA. And Sotheby's are the IPF hosts for 2012 and 13. And the IPF came out of really increasingly urgent discussions around the role of cultural philanthropy with ever more squeezed public funding, the nature of private-public partnerships, and the need to establish more meaningful, long-lasting relationships between different cultural actors. The aim of the IPF, then, is to offer a framework whereby these different actors, whether they be artist, curator, biennale, patron, foundation, public institution, are allowed to benefit from and rethink their relationship to one another. By creating a structure that sees a group of individuals and organizations come together to collectively support the production of new works for an exhibition that subsequently get placed in a public collection, we are hoping to send a strong signal about the potential of public-private partnerships. Instead of a series of binary relations between a patron and a museum or an artist and a curator, this chain of relations is, we hope, one way of rethinking what it means to produce within a given system, whilst attempting to outmaneuver, perhaps, commercial interests. We are incredibly pleased to be supporting the Venice Biennial this year and to be working with Massimiliano Gioni, who from a very early stage has been incredibly enthusiastic and supportive about our way of working. And we're asking a lot of different people to work perhaps in different ways, so thank you to that. So I shall now pass the floor on to you, Mr. Massimiliano, who will give a brief overview and introduction to his ideas for this year's international exhibition. And after the talk, Massimiliano will be joined on stage by Ute Meta Bauer, and we'll have a little discussion about the works, and then hopefully there'll be lots of time for questions afterwards. Shall I read your bio?
Oh, if you, I don't know, you decide.
Massimiliano's bio is lengthy, but I'll just briefly say he's the Associate Director of the new museum and director of exhibitions there. He's the artistic director of the Niccolo Trasadi Foundation in Milan, and is, of course, the director of this year's Venice Biennale. Thank you, Massimiliano.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Gregor. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Candida, and the Outset Fund for all your help and support to the Venice Biennale. I just gonna start with two short premises. First of all, well, three short premises. First of all, I gave a very similar presentation this morning to the press. I saw there is somebody who was there and he's come back. I'm sorry, it will be exactly the same. The second premise is that I'm up here by myself, but to make a biennale, it takes literally a village, as they say in America. And so I'm very thankful to the whole team of the Venice Biennale, to my team in New York, to the many people that are helping and supporting. I see also Rodrigo Mora and Tim Saltarelli in the audience, who have been very, very great accomplices in the research phase of my exhibition, but I'm the only one who should take the blame for all the mistakes. And the second premise is that I'm gonna try to run through 60 slides. It's a quite dense presentation, which is only appropriate for an exhibition that deals with the excess of information and images in our society, but it's also a very small slice of what the exhibition will be. It's roughly 35% of what it's going to be in the exhibition, so I hope there is plenty of space for surprises, and clearly I will not illustrate or present all the works in the artist, of the artist in the show. And I also have finally to thank the artist, because Venice is quite a large exhibition, but with a quite tiny budget, and many people are helping, but most importantly the artist and many of their representatives are really going overboard to help us realize this show, and so I'm very thankful to them. The exhibition, well, another premise, now too many premises, but I'm sure you all know that the Venice Biennale is basically brings together two main components. On one hand, the national pavilions. This year we're going to have 88 national pavilions. Over 30 of them are situated in the Giardini, and many others are scattered around the city. The pavilions are each curated by different curators, and they are usually autonomously selected, the artists, by various committees or by curators, and I don't have a direct influence on them, but I think their presence make the Venice Biennale quite extraordinary and quite unique, because there is literally a polyphony of voices that comes to Venice for 6 months from various places in the world. This year including also the Vatican, that decided to join the nations that have a pavilion. Don't laugh, because they have a control on your future. The second component is the international exhibition, which is the one I'm asked to curate, and which takes place usually in two main spaces. One is the central pavilion in the Giardini, and the other is in the Arsenale, particularly in the first part of the Arsenale. This year, biennial, this year international exhibition is titled Il Palazzo Enciclopedico, in English, the Encyclopedic Palace, which is this weird object you see in this slide. It was built by Marino Auriti. Marino Auriti was an Italian-American from Abruzzo who moved to Pennsylvania, to the rural areas of Pennsylvania. He was an auto mechanic with a passion for art, and he built around the 50s the model for a museum that, according to his writings, should have housed all the world's knowledge. It was meant to be 700 meters tall, and it should have been 136 floors high, and should have occupied 16 blocks of the city of Washington. Obviously, it was never realized. He only existed as a model, but Auriti was so proud and so convinced of his dream that he, in fact, patented this object, and so I think it's the only artwork I'm aware of that even is deposited at the patent office of the United States of America. This impossible dream, the dream of universal, all-embracing knowledge, of course, not only obsessed Marino Auriti, but is a dream that recurs throughout the history of art and the history of humanity. I often start with a quote from Plato in the Timaeus, who says that nothing is sweeter than knowing everything. And I think it's a sentence that many of the artists in the show would subscribe to. Auriti and its palace encapsulate many of the themes that animate the exhibition. The Encyclopedic Palace is an exhibition about knowledge and about the desire to know and represent or see everything, and about the point in which this desire turns into an obsession and into a delirium. Auriti's palace was an imaginary museum, literally, to the point that it was never realized, and the exhibition itself focused on the imaginary and the domain of imagination. Some questions are at the basis of the show, and particularly one of the questions is, how do we give form to the images in our heads, and even why do we have images in our heads in the first place? And what is the space of what these internal images, as Hans Belting has called them, in a society and in a world that it's more and more colonized by artificial images and by exterior images. The exhibition combines historical works and contemporary works. It spans roughly 100 years of history, not in a systematic linear manner, but more in a scattered fashion. I think that's also quite unusual in the recent history of biennials, but surprisingly enough, it was quite common in the history of the Venice Biennale up until the 90s. It includes more than 150 artists from 38 countries, and it's structured more, I think, as a temporary museum than as a traditional biennial. It's a museum in which the distinction between professional artists and amateurs is often blurred. The distinction between insider and outsiders is often complicated. It's ultimately a show about the autodidact and about the self-taught, and maybe I also identify a little bit in the figure and in the never-ending challenge to structure knowledge and put order in the chaos that goes on in our minds, and in mine in particular. The exhibition takes what I call, again, by quoting Hans Belting, it takes an anthropological approach to images. What it means is that it combines art, but also other figurative expressions that were not necessarily born as artworks, but that I believe offer interesting and illuminating examples on our relationship to images. I think to synthesize the show, I would say it's an exhibition about visions and vision. And in fact, at its very core, it starts with this another strange object that I'm not sure if it was an artwork in the first place, which is Carl Gustav Jung's Red Book. The Red Book was a manuscript that Jung worked on for more than 15 years. He started it in 1913 when he was 39, and he was going through a quite difficult period in his life. He just famously had his breakup with Sigmund Freud, and he claimed that he was nearing a nervous breakdown, and so he started this book in which he collected dreams, he collected visions, and he described a sort of initiation trip in his own mind. It's a beautiful book. It's all been illustrated and illuminated by Jung. Also, as you can see, the text is written in a sort of Gothic manner, and it's the first time that it's going to be shown in the context of contemporary art. Jung also had a quite conflictual relationship with contemporary art. He famously reviewed the exhibition by Picasso in the 20s and claimed that basically Picasso was slightly schizophrenic. But I was very interested not only in the beauty of this object, but also in the way this object clearly gives a physical manifestation to the visions of Carl Gustav Jung, who was certainly an expert in dreams. The idea of representing and giving form to the invisible is a recurring theme in the show that includes examples of Hilma af Klint's paintings. Hilma af Klint was a painter who was experimenting with abstraction at the same time as Kandinsky and in the early at the beginning of the last century, but she claimed to make these paintings in a state of trance, or anyway, becoming herself a medium, and I say medium not in a spiritist sense, but literally becoming the place in which the image manifested itself. Augustin Lesage was also quite an eccentric character, was very much loved by the surrealist, and he made these large paintings, sort of altarpieces that he would paint in individual sessions, starting from the left to the right, like it was a sort of automatic writing or a kind of inkjet printer of supernatural forces. Alistair Crowley, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, we're going to include a series of the drawings for his famous tarot cards. Alistair Crowley also lived in Italy for a few years and was eventually kicked out because of his sex life. Sorry, I shouldn't be joking too much, but anyway, the idea of representing or grasping the cosmos in figurative expressions is another of the main themes of the show. Friedrich Schroeder Sonnenstern is another figure that was very much beloved by the surrealists and spent his life making these very awkward, slightly religious drawings in which priests and different creatures are busy with their own bodies and with different forms of liturgies. Actually, religion pops out throughout the show as a vision of the cosmos and as a way to structure knowledge or abstract concepts. This is a selection of Shaker gift drawings that are going to be incorporated in the show. These are drawings that the Shaker communities believed came to them as a gift from God, and we are particularly lucky to have a small selection of these works because they're not easily borrowed. This is another quite unusual group of figurative expressions or figurative objects. Ugo Bernatzik was an anthropologist who traveled particularly in South Pacific Asia in the 30s, and he had a very simple but shocking idea. He introduced paper and pencils in societies that were not figurative or that didn't draw or didn't paint. And then he collected all these drawings from different individuals, and particularly the one on top is the drawings of a shaman's dream from the Solomon's Islands, and the others are maps. And so these are actually examples of the first figurative expression of individuals, and I think they're quite extraordinary. And if you come to the show, you'll see also how some of them are perfectly detailed by also, let's say, our standards, and which I think reveals a lot of the way we perceive or imagine reality. The idea that images can transform the cosmos is also another important premise from the show. Guo Fengzhi was a painter from China who unfortunately was affected by cancer and started making these drawings, mostly self-portraits, in an attempt to cure herself. Unfortunately, it didn't work, but as she was making this talisman, she also grew more and more worried about the state of the cosmos, and so she made these drawings to influence the universe. And along this series of drawings, we're also presenting the drawings that she made in an attempt to stop the SARS epidemic, which I am not sure if she stopped or not, but this is the work of Jean-Friedrich Schnieder. Schnieder is a figure that I think is quite exemplary of similar figures in the exhibition. He's an artist who was fully trained in the language of contemporary art. Roberta Smith has defined him a lapsed conceptualist, which is a definition I love. So he started as a conceptualist and then sort of turned his back to conceptualism and start making these very strange paintings and tapestries. This is a tapestry called Apocalypso, and he sort of called himself out also of the hamster wheel, as Franz West would call it, so the run of the professional art world. And there's going to be a selection of 4 of his paintings and this strange tapestry that is actually painted with watercolors. As I was talking before about cosmographies, this sense of, I call it cosmic stupor, is a sentiment that I try to identify or to identify in the work of a few artists. This is a piece by Artur Zimiewski that he realized 2 years ago, in which he films blind people as they paint the world as they see it, and they're mostly people who are blind from birth. And the paintings are, again, quite extraordinary because they look the way we imagine reality look, and they do so even though the subjects who are painting them have never seen the world. Thierry Decordier, on the other hand, is spending his life looking at the ocean, and particularly at the North Sea, and painting over and over these quite beautiful and oppressive landscapes, of which there is going to be a selection of 10, if I'm not wrong, or 11. The movement from the microscopic to the microscopic is another defining strategy in the exhibition. This is the work of Melvin Motti, who has, among other things, filmed particles of uranium, like you see here, or the work of Ron Nagel. He's a ceramist from LA, who makes these sculptures that he calls sleep studies. He makes them before falling asleep, and they are, again, sort of sculptures that belong to the realm of the unconscious, or the realm of the dream state, but they're also strange lunar landscapes. Anna Zemankova was an outsider, or I mean, the whole point is that I don't know who is an outsider or an insider, but she was a great artist from the Czech Republic that made these beautiful sort of Art Deco abstractions. Geta Bratescu, another, let's say, senior artist, in this case from Romania, of whom we're going to present a series of tapestries, and these tapestries are actually maps of, mental maps of various islands. The show, as it's interested in knowledge, is also particularly focused on the way we know ourselves through representations and through images. So at the center of the show, literally, there is a presentation of the works of Maria Lasnik and Marisa Merz, two artists who have devoted many years of their life. They're both, I think, 90, and they've been over and over depicting themselves and representing themselves through self-portraits. Another of the axis of the show is a reflection on literature and the space of the fantastic. And so many of the artists in the exhibition engage either with literature or with the space, again, of imagination. Cristiana Solu has been making a series of drawings in which she literally illustrates the book of Imaginary Beings by Borges, which is this beautiful anthology in which Borges collected imaginary beings, both from literature and from myths. Roger Calois, he was a para-surrealist writer. I mean, he was friend with all the surrealists until eventually broke out of the group, and throughout his life he collected stones, and he wrote also a beautiful book called The Writing of Stones, and he was describing these stones as the artworks that the earth makes, and so they're sort of spontaneous artworks made by geology itself, and in his own writings he often combined geology with a strange form of mysticism. Rudolf Steiner, I don't know if we can call him a philosopher, but certainly a pedagogue, who was a compulsive lecturer, and somebody who now I sort of understand because this is the second lecture today, but he gave 5,000 lectures in his life. They're all carefully transcribed, and for his lectures he made these drawings that function as his slides in a PowerPoint presentation. He made them on a roll of paper. They were then cut and preserved, and there is going to be a selection of 40 of these drawings, which famously were also very influential for Joseph Beuys's drawings on blackboards. And his lectures span from anything from the life of bees to the act of seeing, to religion, to inner life and outer life. Apparently, he was so much into giving lectures that he would give lectures to workers when they were restoring his house, when they would go on breaks. He would give lectures, and actually a visit to his Oteneum in Dornach is quite special if you happen to go there. These are some examples of his drawings. Of course, as Steiner suggests, the exhibition is an exhibition that deals with obsessions, with compulsions, like the case of Peter Fritz. He was a insurance clerk who in his life built 387 models of imaginary houses in cardboard. Morton Bartlett, he spent his life playing with dolls. He built 16 of them, and then he photographed them in hundreds of dolls, and 5 of them are going to be presented in the exhibition. Achilles Rizzoli, another Italian-American maybe it has to do with being Italian-American, the show. But Achille Rizzoli lived in the West Coast in the States, and by day he would work in an architectural studio, and then in his free time he made these beautifully detailed drawings of architectures, which he actually described as portraits of people. And this confusion between architecture and psychology is another of the recurring themes in the show. As I said, obsessions and compulsions play an important role, and Shinro Take is a Japanese artist who's been collecting and making scrapbooks throughout his life. He makes one every year, and we're going to present 68 of them. It's a sort of personal library, and again, the image of the book as both the keeper of fantasy and also as an endangered species is a recurring element in the exhibition, from Jung's Red Book to Otake's books to Xul Solar books and many other personal libraries. Karl Andre, speaking of a library of sorts, he's going to be represented by a piece called Passport, so not by one of his sculptures, but by a selection of, by this work, which is a series of collages in which he takes his own passport and overlays on the pages images of artworks that influenced him and that compose a sort of personal library of the work that most interested him, seduced him throughout his first years of work. Walter Pichler is an artist who spent his life, while he was a very influential artist at the beginning of the 60s, and then sort of retreated to the countryside of Austria, where he kept building these strange figurative sculptures, for which he also built architectures and little houses. So sort of creating, again, a universe where its creatures could live at home. In the Arsenale, so what you've seen so far is mostly in, was all featured in the central pavilion. In the Arsenale has been structured as a progression from natural forms to artificial forms. It's not a completely oppressive grid, but I wanted to follow this organization, which is the organization of the Wunderkammer of the 16th and 17th century, to sort of guide the viewer through the exhibition, and also to sort of rediscover this form of associative thinking that was very common in the late Renaissance and in the Baroque, and which on many levels I think resonates with our experience of knowledge today. There seems to be more an experience of connecting heterogeneous materials rather than finding a linear path through them. In the Arsenale, so also catalogs and taxonomies and forms of organizations return, like the photography of Okai Ojekere, who's a photographer from Nigeria, who has assembled thousands of photos of hairstyles. Ling Su, a Chinese artist who makes these sort of micrographic representations of nature. Christopher Williams, of which will present a selection of his photographs of the Blaschka models, the glass models that were built by the Blaschka's brothers, actually as tools in teaching and in studying biology. Elliot Porter, a photographer with the National Geographic, who took these beautiful photos and developed a camera that would allow him to catch birds in flights. This idea that through art we can see more is, again, one of the foundations of the exhibition. This is Edward Spelterini. He was a balloonist and a photographer. He's the first person that took a photograph of the pyramid from the air, and he took a series of beautiful photos all around the world. I like to think of him as a sort of early Gursky, but he took his balloon to Johannesburg, to Egypt, to many places, and took these striking views also of the Alps from 3,000 and 4,000 meters on board of his balloon. Yüksel Arslan, a Turkish artist who's been living in Paris for a while, who's been composing a kind of personal encyclopedia of humanities, and they look like medical tables from medical treatises. Just like Arslan has been composing a sort of summa of his own work, another summa or another all-encompassing system is going to be Robert Crumb's Genesis drawings, which are going to be presented in their entirety. Shiniki Sawada is a Japanese artist who has been forming a sort of bestiary, and actually is going to be presented inside the Genesis by Crumb. Papa Ibratol, he's a Senegalese artist who actually received recently a tribute in the Dakar Biennale. He's not really been seen much in Europe, but he's the founding father of contemporary art in Senegal, and he makes, among many other works, he makes these beautiful tapestries that often illustrate legends or myths, some of them real and some of them fictional or sort of romanticized. And speaking of, well, myths and myths of origins, Camille Enrault is a French artist who has started a research project at the Smithsonian in which she's investigating various myths of origins and narratives of the beginning of the universe that include the slideshow for the Jehovah's Witnesses to other creation myths, both from the past and the present. Neil Belufa, of whom we are going to present this piece, which is a sort of science fiction video, but done with very simple materials and very simple objects. And again, the possibility of envisioning the future is one of the themes that return in the show. For example, from Alistair Crowley's Tarots to Neil Belufa's film, or like in this case of Steve McQueen's piece called Once Upon a Time, which is a film in which Steve McQueen juxtaposes the sound of episodes of glossolalia, or people speaking in tongues, with the images that NASA sent in outer space in the 70s, the famous 117 images that were recorded on the gold plate, and they were meant for communication with the aliens. And probably it's the reason why the aliens never came to Earth, because they saw the pictures. They provide a very stereotypical view of life on Earth. But ultimately, these are also examples of humans trying to communicate through images. Speaking of the ways in which we represent ourselves and we gave images of ourselves, a particular section of the Arsenale is curated by Cindy Sherman. So I approached Cindy, and because she spent her life representing herself as another, I asked her if she wanted to switch roles a little, and so she curated a show instead of presenting her own work. And this section deals mostly with representations of bodies. And of course, as banal as it sounds, you all know that the word image comes from the Latin imago, which was nothing but the death mask. And so from its own etymology, the word image has a promiscuous relationship with humans. It's literally what you cast a face of and what you put on a dead body to preserve its memory and its image as such. And so Cindy has explored a series of works, particularly that deal also with hyperrealism and forms of representation that are so real that turn into their opposite. So in these sections, there are roughly 30 artists, and again, in a combination across histories and different time zones. And so these are some of the examples of the work in the show. She also collects photo albums, and so she's going to display a few of her own private photo albums. Among them, this, which is called Casa Susanna, which was a place where people went and dressed up, and she's been collecting images from this town in north upstate New York. Speaking of bodies and desires, Sharon Hayes is realizing a remake of Pierpaolo Pasolini's Love Meetings. So she's going around America interviewing people about sexuality, desires, and gender. And again, speaking of gender and bodies, Ryan Trecarten is realizing quite an ambitious piece that introduces the sort of final part of the Arsenale, in which artists deal more explicitly with information society and with image society. So for example, Wade Guyton will feature 3 of his large inkjet paintings, Albert Oehling a series of collages that deal with advertisement and found imagery. Alice Channer with these large banners of prosthetics. Chan Horowitz, another senior artist who was a pioneer of, let's say, optical art and technology, of whom we are presenting a series of drawings. Many of them appear to be machine-made, but they're all made by hand. Simon Denny, an artist who's interested in the circulation and the program obsolescence of technology. Helen Martin, an artist who I'm sure many of you have seen a recent show here in London, who deals with packaging of commodities. And Mark Leckie, who knocking on every wooden surface, is developing a new piece that continues his research on what he refers to as the dampness and the addressability of things, or in different terms, the ontology of the image in digital society. Yuri Ankarani, who is an artist from Italy, who has worked with a team of doctors who use this weird computer to perform surgery. And the film is quite startling because you see the body from inside, and it's also quite disturbing. And at the very end of the Arsenale, this piece by Walter De Maria will end my section of the show, and it's a piece called Apollo's Ecstasy, which has many of the works of Walter De Maria, which incredibly enough is for the first time featured in the Venice Biennale. Is a sort of, as another piece of his is called, is a machine that would solve every problem in the world. So it's a perfect pure form that, according to the artist, sort of contains all endless numerological possibilities. Past the end of my exhibition, then the Arsenale continues through many other national pavilions, and then dotting the outdoor space of the Arsenale, there are also a series of more performative works, such as Ragnar Kjartansson, who is working on a performance involving musicians, and Marco Paolini, who is an actor and director who will have a series of presentations about jobs that are disappearing in Italy, a sort of lexicon of labor that disappears. And John Bock, whose image I choose to end because it's maybe a portrait of the curator at the end of the exhibition, once the critics start coming in and slap him on the face. And that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that whistle-stop tour of the exhibition. I'm really pleased now to introduce Ute Meta Bauer, who will talk to Massimiliano perhaps about some of what we've seen. Ute Meta Bauer is currently a professor and dean of the School of Fine Art at the Royal College of Art, London. Bauer was curator of the Future Archive at NBK in Berlin in 2012, artistic director of the 3rd Berlin Biennale for Contemporary Art in 2004, and co-curator of Documenta 11, 2001-2. Ute Meta Bauer has contributed and edited many publications, and recently the compilation Ute Meta Bauer Interviews 1992 to 2010 was published by NBK. Many thanks, Ute.
So thanks so much to give us an insight in your palace that you're unfolding in Venice. Yeah, maybe just like, what might be very interesting now as we see like the range of works like outsider art, like you have many female artists, and it's a lot of drawing, paintings. To me, it's quite interesting now, how will you organize that, like in the space? And you just mentioned before when we had a short conversation that for you it's also critical not to have so many standalone presentations. You really want to connect those works. Yeah. Maybe you can say something about it.
Is the light engineer Catherine Bigelow? It's like being in Zero Dark 30 up here. We're going to get waterboarded between. No, well, as I mentioned, on a certain level, the model for this exhibition is less the biennial as the kind of free-for-all that I've come to expect, particularly from Venice, this sort of energetic display of works, and particularly in large scale, and it's more model after the idea of the museum, or it's a crossover, I think, between a theme show and a museum. So that's why I call it a temporary museum, because it's a museum devoted to some problems, and so the show is a little more choreographed than also the benefit of the doubt. I might tell you all this, but then you come and you think it looks like any other biennial, but that's But so the way I approached it was more as a museum, which meant also going after particular objects and not just asking for new works. And it meant also building the show more through discrete objects rather than new productions, even though there are many new productions. And then as I was working on the show, I started also doing a lot of research about particularly the so-called palaces of memory and the theaters of memory. And one of the inspiring books for this show is Frances Yates' The Art of Memory, in which she recalls how, also funnily enough, in Venice itself, there was a gentleman whose name was Giulio Camillo, who supposedly was the man who knew everything, and he was so popular that the King of France invited him to his court to develop this theater of memory. And basically throughout the Baroque and late Renaissance, there is a tradition of architecture that is built around images as a tool to remember and know things. And so even though it will not be apparent in the exhibition, I also tried to think of the show that way, so that in every room there is a piece that somehow summarizes that room, or that every room is built through the images in a certain way, so that the structure of the show reflects also maybe what the theme of the show is.
I mean, of course, this links also very strongly to Venice and the period when Venice was basically in its high peak. Yeah. So it's quite interesting also to talk about like historical collections. I mean, you mentioned now also the kind of the memory atlas. I mean, to me immediately also comes Giordano Bruno, but also like Appie Warburg's Mnemosyne Atlas. So I'm still interested in the way you try to organize the material, because that was in a kind of like Mnemosyne way, or in the Giordano Bruno, in the memory theater, very crucial. How do you arrange the rooms? From where do you go
well, there's
forward?
A scary thought, because many of the people you mentioned, they all went crazy, so. No? From Warburg, poor guy. And,
he got cured.
So hopefully, you know, knocking on wood. And also Jung, I mean, he started the book at the moment of crisis. So, I mean, there is another underlying theme, which is the sort of curative power of images, and which, of course, we are all jaded and we don't believe in it, but to steal the famous example from William Mitchell, he says, you know, to the skeptic that doesn't believe in the power of image, ask him if he would ever scratch the eyes off the photograph of his mother. And I'm sure all of you with your cell phones full of images, you wouldn't erase the picture of your boyfriend. Or so that there is still a magic, talismanic quality of images, which is even stranger because we live in a society inflated with images. So, I mean, to go back to some of the figures you mentioned, I mean, Warburg is right now probably rolling in his grave, because in the last year and a half it's been so common to blaming for everything. But for me, what was more inspiring, which is something present in his writings and also in the writings of many other theoreticians of images, was the idea that to understand images you have to go beyond the distinction of the artwork. And you know, if you think of David Friedberg and his beautiful book, The Power of Images, or Warburg, or Régis Debray, and even Roland Barthes, many writers who have approached images to understand how they function, they very soon understood that if you only look at artworks by themselves, you're not going to learn anything, but you have to see them in dialogue with other forms of figurative expression. And so that has helped me a little bit also in understanding how the inclusion of more heterogeneous material maybe can help enriching the texture of the show, and also taking the artwork out of its comfort zone, which often is, the artwork is beautiful, let's stare at it in awe and get somebody with lots of money to pay for it. You know, that's, I think there is a strange equation between the autonomy of the artwork and its market value, and I think by bringing in objects that are less recognized as artworks, you can also bring the artwork back to its necessary, or to its necessity more than its just stupor, and you look at it and you like it because it's an artwork. I don't know if it makes sense.
It does make sense. You mentioned also quite a number of so-called outsider artists, and very often, while they were not recognized from the art world, they served as a very important inspiration for artists, and the respect from artists to outsider art is often very high. I mean, you mentioned the surrealists, but even like later, I mean, there was always this kind of juxtaposition. And will you put them into connection, or like how will you kind of show that?
They are displayed next to the insider artists, and I think that's quite unusual. And I mean, it's something I've been doing for a little bit and learning how to do it also in a way that doesn't suggest the sort of sentimental kitsch that the outsider artist is the real visionary and the professional artist is a professional. So it took me also a little bit of time to understand how can you have that inclusion that raises questions but not raises the wrong assumptions. And I don't know if I succeeded, but there was a process that took a little while. But so yes, they're going to be shown next to each other. I think the idea is sort of, I hope it's absolving two functions. On one hand, after all, also when you do a biennale, you are asked to capture a moment in time, and certainly we've been going through a few years in which outsider art has been more and more looked at again for different reasons. At the same time, I think by that inclusion, as I said before, something interesting happens to both. The artwork becomes more porous, and so you see the artwork, but you also see the story in the artwork, so it becomes more a storytelling device and not just a beautiful object. The artwork also becomes more part of culture and not just a symbol of excellence. And on the other hand, the outsider work offers examples on ways in which people traffic in image or use images. So I think there is a nice short circuit. I mean, of course, I'm also worried because the moment you include that material, there is a sort of process of canonization of that material. And my interest in that material is precisely because it helps break in the canon. But once you put it there, it's in the canon. But that's, you know, the problem of whoever will do the next show that, or whoever will write about the show that has somehow to take it apart and rewrite a new canon in reaction to it. So,
I mean, it's also like, I mean, as you said, like there's the notion of the Wunderkammer and collecting the world and kind of having it all to your display. There's also something quite imperial in that.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that the show happens in the Arsenale, for example, for me was quite interesting. The Arsenale is a building that it's spoken about by Dante in his Divine Comedy in the Inferno, and it was in the 16th century was the largest factory in the world. It's quite amazing. To build the dome of St. Peter's, it took, I think, 10, 15 years, 200 people working, and in the Arsenale, every year there were between 500 and 800 people, so it was literally like the largest factory in the world, and it was also referred to as the factory of the marvelous, and clearly, though, the idea of the marvelous was very much related to the idea of the colonies. I mean, there they were building the boats and the weapons that would go and conquer the colonies. So there is a sort of imperialistic undertone to the idea of also of the cabinet. It's the place where you put all the goods of the world at your disposal, and it's also not so distant relative of the biennial. I mean, the biennial, particularly the Venice Biennale, is the oldest biennale, and so it's the biennale that was born out of the international expositions of 1851 and of the 19th century. So in its own ambition, the biennale is also tied to many of these connotations. And I thought that in the choice of the Encyclopedic Palace as a model for a building that was never realized, there was also an antidote to that imperialistic notion, because from the beginning the show is sort of recognizing that it's impossible to know everything and that it's impossible to bring everything at your disposal. So it's very much also a show about what I call the flights of the imagination and of being conscious that you're just imagining and that you cannot grasp it all. And you know, the people who got to see the Aleph in Borges' novel, they go crazy. So it's also about this idea that you cannot grasp totality, and the totality is the other side of madness. So.
I mean, they also said, like at the turn of last century, that in a moment of like wars over the world and in a moment of crisis, more utopian images are coming up, specifically also in art. And I mean, we saw now quite a number of utopian images, and while we are, I would say, worldwide in a slight state of crisis, could you maybe say something to that?
Yeah, I mean, the question, which I don't know if I understand it correctly, is a question I ask myself: do I make a biennial that engages with current events? And you know, the process, at least for me, on how you make a biennial is you go through lists of possibilities and you kind of exclude. And certainly one of the shows I had in mind was a show also about, let's say, the mass or the public and notions of consensus and dissent. And for a while it was an idea I entertained, but then I try to identify a theme that I feel is deep enough to go beyond current events. And you know, I don't know if this is the case, but that's what I came to as a conclusion, that it's an exhibition that interrogates the sort of internal images. And as banal as it sounds, like every time I think about it, it's quite incredible that, you know, inside our head we don't have necessarily language, but we have something that is an image. And the experience of seeing an artwork, and this is again not my idea, I wish it was, but the experience of seeing an artwork or seeing a movie, for example, is so magical because it's as though you're seeing what's inside you projected outside you. And that, I think, as cheesy as it sounds, is one of the magic of art. And so I was more excited to think of a show that talks about that than a show that talks about current events. On the other hand, being a show that intersects often with surrealism, and being a show that talks about mostly what you see when you close your eyes. One of the icons in the show is actually going to be André Breton's mask. He had his face cast, and he kept in his office behind this desk a mask of himself, which, by the way, should be what every teacher should do, to have a portrait of themselves behind themselves. And it's a beautiful mask of himself with his eyes closed. And I think that's also what the show is about. It's what you see when you close your eyes, or when you try to see so much. And so I think ultimately, even though even the surrealist political position was often complicated, they accused each other of being crypto-fascist, which I'm sure somebody will accuse me of in this show, and they accused each other of not being communist enough. And though they all believed that in the gesture of closing your eyes and in the space of dream, there was an emancipatory force, and there was a political force. No? The surrealism, for a while, they called their magazine the Surrealism in Service of the Revolution. The tool of the revolution was the dream. And I mean, again, it sounds a little cheesy, but I do believe there is also a political tension in dreams. And maybe it's a show about too much about closing your eyes, but I think there are interesting things to find there too. So.
Yeah, but it's also about the future. I mean, like what can introduce the future. But what I also want to mention, I mean, historically, the pavilions also in the past, like let's say 20, 30 years ago, they would show often like very achieved artists, like introducing their lifetime work. It was like the biggest award that an artist could get to represent their country with very specific work. In the meantime, then Aperto was founded in the early 80s to kind of bring more emerging art to Venice that would counter the national pavilions, so were a bit more established art. And I have the feeling it's kind of reversed in the meantime, like that the pavilions bring more, like not like maybe the youngest, but like more really mid-career emerging artists, important positions. And so this kind of role is also obsolete in a way for the national pavilion.
I also felt, I mean, the national pavilions, particularly this time, I feel there are many people I also have worked with, people of my generation, whatever that means, which I thought was quite exciting. It feels like the age has dropped a little bit, or my age has increased, and I'm in denial. But I think also what has happened in the meanwhile, particularly in relation to Aperto, is that there are so many more outlets for the emerging artists. Even though there are many younger artists in this show, I also felt it was important to include dead artists, to include senior artists, because paradoxically it's become expected that you bring the young, and even from a financial point of view, you know, it's much easier to get support for any young artist, because there is an industry that wants the young artist to produce a new work, so that somebody wants to buy it, etc., etc. But you know, I'm struggling to bring the Encyclopedic Palace, because nobody has an invested interest in bringing that crazy object there, because there is no economy for it. And so I felt also maybe a little bit reassured that at least something was slightly wrong, and therefore interesting, in including these things, because there is not even a structure that allows them to be included.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to me it's quite interesting to have a more focused exhibition in the center, and then you have, like you said, it's 88 national contributions. That's quite a lot. That really kind of like juxtaposes what like you will have in the international exhibition. So it's not a standalone. No. There is a lot of contextualization around. But did you had any conversation, like, do the national commissioners like react to your topic?
It depends. I mean, some pavilions, they start choosing their curators or their artists even before the director of the Biennale is chosen, because they are healthy countries in which they can program 2 years in advance, while in Italy is if you get 1 year, you're lucky. So some pavilions are already decided. Then after you're nominated, there is a meeting with all the representatives in which you illustrate some of your ideas, and then the various nations can decide if they want to respond to it or not. But even if they do, I think when you have 88 nations, clearly even the most common theme will not be, thank God, interpreted in the same way that it's interpreted by me. So that creates a nice polyphony that also is reflected in the fact that clearly being a contemporary artist in some places is not the same as being contemporary artist in Italy, and so each one brings to the dialogue different perspectives. And then there are some pavilions that really wait until the theme is out and decide. For example, I think the Polish pavilion does that, and then it's more a call to find artists or works that relate to this specific theme.
I'm sure there's many questions in the audience, and I just want to add that Massimiliano had 10 months to put this show together, so it's obviously clear that this Encyclopedic Palace will not be the complete palace. It is a beginning of that palace, and I think it's also an opportunity for you to have questions, and I'm sure many of you have some.
You talk about Hans Belting, and but then you aim at gathering a museum, which is exactly what murdered the presence of the work of art. For example, when it was taken out of the magic places or the places of worship, for example. So, isn't there like underlying contradiction to the whole show?
It is a folly, and also going back to what Ute was saying. Not only my palace has many wings that are still unbuilt, but the whole premise of the show, in a way, is that you cannot finish it or build it. To answer your question, which is quite interesting about the role of the museum, I think, yes, the museum historically might have taken the objects out of the museum, out of the sacred space, but things are also quite different today, and I think what is also killing the artwork, and I don't even want to, I don't want to portray myself as a paladin of the anti-market crusade, because I'm also very compromised with it, but there is another dispositive that it's killing the sacred, and it's the fair, it's the auction price. I mean, it's producing another form of sacred in which the price becomes sort of supernatural. But it's, I think, erasing the complexity of the artwork. It's more just the artwork is a sort of prize that comes with different levels, and you win first, second, or so on. So for me, paradoxically, the museum is also the place where now that experience of the sacred can be recuperated, and also that's why I think of the show more as a museum and less as a biennial, because on the other hand, I've seen so many biennials that subscribe to what Peter Sheldon has called festivalism, and so in which the artwork is like big and entertaining and interactive, and I wanted also to step back a bit and think of the show. On many levels, the show is also very traditional. It's like pictures on the walls, but I think by embracing a grammar of the museum, which is also not the art museum, it's the museum as a place where different artifacts can exist, then you can maybe rediscover a different relationship with artworks. You know, there is because I was mentioning Roger Calois, there is a beautiful story that Roger Calois talks about when he goes and see the opening of the museum in Seoul, and he says that people, it's in the 50s, I think, and he says that people are going to the museum, but in front of the Buddha statues, there are historical artifacts, they are still kneeling down because they don't see the artwork, they see the Buddha. And I mean, I cannot claim that this show will do that, but I think my idea of museum is something like that, where the object still preserves a confusion about its function. And it's a beautiful thing to look at, but it's also a thing that can tell you about who made it and can tell you about other values and ideas that are incorporated in that object.
Hi, my name is Stella. I hope it's not a boring question, but I was just asking myself, actually asking you, how you're going to bring so many of the stories that you've been telling us tonight into the exhibition. Because I think what seems so interesting to me is how loaded or how interesting the stories that are associated with these works are, and how important they seem to be to your vision. It's been a beautiful night of storytelling, so thank you. But how, on a very practical level, captions or interpretation, how would that work in the show?
You know, I still haven't fully decided that, because many of the shows I've done recently were very heavy on text. You know, I had like a little epiphany, and I should give him credit, not seeing a show by Roger Bruegel, who is a curator whose work I feel completely unrelated to, but I saw once a show of his in which he had these captions throughout the show, and they were building a kind of parallel narrative to the exhibition, and that was a complete shock, and because I thought, oh, you can also do that, you know, and it was also a shock compared to what captions are in many museums that are this kind of didactic, sterilized truth about the work. And so actually, since then, I made lots of shows in which the voice of the caption is quite personal, and I work with a friend whose name is Chris Wiley, and he's basically the narrator of the shows in the captions, and we have been working together for a few years, and so he's the kind of voice, and we sit down, we go through each work and discuss how to kind of build the narrative. So this has been done also this time, and he might go crazy like Warburg, because he wrote like 155 entries in the past few months, cranking out like 2 entries a day or 3 entries a day on every piece. And what I haven't decided, of course there is a guide, I haven't decided yet if also all the captions are going to be physically in the show, because I would prefer not to, but I'm not sure if every viewer will get the guide. And in a smaller show, usually I put these long texts. In a bigger show, I'm still undecided. I would rather have the viewer sort of carrying the narration with him or her, but I'm nervous that then maybe not all the viewers will have the narrative, but then if I put them on the walls, in a biennial, you know, when you have like a day, you have 10,000 people, you're going to have like logistical problems walking around. So I haven't decided yet, but all the texts have been prepared, and you know, a show like this, and a previous show I've done in Korea, and some of the shows I've been doing in New York, they're also teamworks, and that's very important to say. You know, I've been now working with a few people over and over, and they are people that work with me on the design, people that work with me on the text, and so they are quite collaborative projects. And another show that was also a big epiphany was Harald Zeman's Bachelor's Machine, in the way the catalog was built with Jean Claire as a sort of additional research tool. And you know, maybe any of these will just not even be noticed, but I think there are interesting ways to think how you approach an exhibition.
But I thank you for your question too, and this is what I meant before. I mean, it will be very interesting. How do you organize the material? Because, of course, in Encyclopédie, there is a kind of like a structure, and like how do you deal with this amount of information? And even you mentioned Jung. I mean, he was organizing his material.
Well, but the show is less about the Enlightenment encyclopedia. It's more about the sort of proto-encyclopedia, which somehow resembles also, I think, our experience of knowledge today with our cell phones and computers. So there is one of the first encyclopedias of the 17th century, as many of the medieval encyclopedias and so on. It's composed by assembling and rewriting also former treatises, and then he has an entire book titled Chaos, and that's where the writer puts all the information he couldn't fit into the system, and so maybe, unfortunately, my Encyclopedic Palace will be more similar to that kind of encyclopedia, which, though, I feel it's more similar to our experience of knowledge today. I think, I don't know if it'll be apparent in the show, but on many levels, this show, for me, is about our knowledge society and our image society today, and it's about an economy of knowledge in which information is power and is money, in which images are money, and so maybe it sort of prepares a prehistory of that, but it's very much also about how knowledge excludes and includes people. And Eric van Lieshout is doing this film in which he talks to his family, talks to his brother who's unemployed, and a lot of, I haven't seen it yet, but a lot of the piece is about who has right to know. And I think also the piece of Sharon Hayes deals with who has access to information and how that also becomes exclusive and becomes a sort of parallel economy, of which I think, you know, today, and that also relates to the work of younger artists. Today we live in a society of knowledge, but a society in which secret and access to information are equally important, and so that's also what this show is maybe laterally about.
When we got, until the mic comes, I think it's also, it might be interesting not to have labels at all, because the name is so critical today.
Yeah.
So.
As the chief architect of the old palace, do you think you have to be Faustian?
Have to be what?
Faustian. Faust?
Yeah, I mean, it is a show that is quite Faustian, but I don't, you know, Auriti was not an architect. It's a show also of bricoleurs, and I identify more in the mechanic that builds the impossible palace than like the architect. And you know, as I say, it's a show also about being an autodidact, and ultimately that's also, you know, when this is getting too biographical, but when they ask you to do the Biennale, it's a great honor, but the expectations are also completely insane. And I also thought that it was better to recognize that it's more a bricoleur exercise than an architectural plan. And but you know, even if I think I recognize it the moment you put out the list and so on, people, or the name, I mean, the encyclopedic as a word can suggest also many of sort of imperialistic or megalomaniac tendencies, and hopefully they're not there, or if they're there, they're interesting. But
just wanted to say thank you very much to Massimiliano and to Ute. I think it would be very interesting to see how this kind of physical encounter gets played out in Venice. So thank you very much, and thank you very much again to ICA and to everyone for coming. Thank you.
thank you.